Welcome, specimens, and good start of the weekend, because today is Friday, and also, I guess, good start of October, because today is the 1st of October. What we have to go over today is the start of yet another raid video, because the last time we went looking for raids, it was over 10 days ago, so we can take a look at some of the things that changed, and some of the things did change, fortunately for this video, otherwise there would be no reason to make one. Now, as you are well versed in this matter, you know that the first thing you do when you go and look at how the raids are doing is checking how many people are playing the raid and how many people of which specs and classes are playing the raid, the popularity and the spread of the different specs. The first thing that we have to look at and notice when we go over this is the fact that there has been a shakeup in the status quo of the top 3, because Balanced Druid, Arms Warrior, and Havoc Demon Hunter have remained the most popular specs for raid encounters for weeks now in Mythic. Instead, we have gotten a continued rise of Beast Mastery. Last few weeks, I was mentioning how Beast Mastery was bound to get up to Marksmanship. It was even below the half, below the middle of the pack, and then week by week, it was getting closer and closer and closer, and last week, over 10 days ago, we looked at Beast Mastery finally passing Marksmanship, but they did not stop. They continued, and now they passed Havoc as well, and they are, eventually, it seems like, on collision course to go and pass Arms Warriors as well. Now, this is of course a completely confusing movement, because Beast Mastery is not particularly good. This is not one of the cases where this hidden OP spec is being discovered mid-tier, so everyone is quickly re-rolling to Beast Mastery now that they discovered their secret. Beast Mastery is still pretty mediocre. The reason mostly is that Hunter is the most popular class in the game, is played by a massive amount of people, and in raids up to this point it was Marksmanship that was keeping the reins of the class as a whole, and then slowly over time Marksmanship has started lagging behind. They also have two different types of damage profiles. Marksmanship is much more focused on AoE, burst AoE, by being Night Fae with Wild Spirits, etc, etc, whereas Beast Mastery can offer more single target, can offer more cleave and sustain damage compared to Marksmanship. Now, the fact that I'm saying it's better than Marksmanship doesn't mean it's actually good. But Beast Mastery is still pretty mediocre as a spec in raid encounters. Yet, it has been growing at a very accelerated pace. Another thing worth mentioning, and this was pretty confusing, Destruction has been also losing players to Demonology Warlocks. This is also kind of confusing because Destruction wasn't doing too well as a whole in the raid. It has been one of the worst specs in terms of performance in the raid, and the worst range DPS spec when it comes to raiding for weeks now, yet it was consistently the more populated and the more popular spec for Warlocks. This was very confusing. I never quite got it. I barely even have and have seen Warlocks in my raids being Destruction. Most of the time the decision fell to, do we want single target? Okay, I'm Demonology. Do we want AoE? Okay, I'm Affliction. I barely even saw Destruction myself, and yet it was very, very popular. Now it has started dropping down a little bit more in representation. What we did follow days ago was also the fact that Fire Mage had gotten past Frost Mage and became the new most popular spec for mages. This was a similar situation to Beast Mastery. Fire Mage is not really doing well, and it's not particularly doing better than Frost or than Arcane. It's just that more mage players have decided to go Fire. I guess because in the mediocrity of all three specs right now, Fire Mage is the better to play, the more fun, the more engaging to play, so they might as well have a little bit more fun when they play a spec that is not particularly strong. Another thing worth noting is that this moment in time is the lowest amount of representation that Unholy DK have had since the start of Shadowlands. Very early since the start, they were near the top 3. They have kept a very high population in raids for months, several months. They quickly fell off the top 3 after they got nerfed a few weeks into Castonatria, but they were still popular. Then 9.1 comes in, then AMZ gets nerfed, and Unholy has continuously, slowly but steadily kept losing representation to other specs. And at this moment, they are now officially middle of the pack in popularity as well, not just in damage. In fact, in damage they are bottom of the pack, but it has been a pretty slow but consistent fall for Unholy DKs. Then lastly, a few words for the popularity of tanks, mostly because, remember all those weeks ago where I was following closely the fact that Blood DK was bound to pass Vengeance. That was weeks ago, now it's well over Vengeance. The other thing I wanted to point out was that now it's even the turn of Protection and Guardian Druid to get progressively closer to Vengeance as a mythic raiding tank. It is likely that by the end of the tier, by the end of the raid, preparing for the next raid, Vengeance will have gone below both Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin. Now, when it comes to the performance, there is actually one very clear thing we have to talk about in the changes that happen between weeks, which is Balance Druid. So a while ago, I made my point trying to say that we were in a very bizarre situation where all of the most popular, all of the most played specs, with the only exception of Arms Warrior, they were at the bottom of performance. We looked at things like Havoc, Demon Hunter, Marksmanship, Balance Druid, Shadow Priest, Beast Mastery, Unholy, Frost Mage and Destruction Warlock. Those were the most popular specs in the raid, and they were here. You know, they were at the bottom, right? They were doing badly, despite being the most played specs. Now we have gotten a second spec together with Arms to more closely follow its popularity. To give a reason as to why they are so popular now, Balance Druid has gotten massively ahead to what they were before in. They have jumped several positions. They have now gotten themselves into the top 5 and the best of the ranged DPS specs, which is also important when looking at damage, dividing the melee camp from the ranged camp. The other performers at the top have remained the same. The 3 rogue specs, together with Arms Warrior, Feral Druid and Windwalker Monk, have remained there for the majority of the last few weeks, couple of months, basically the latter part of the tier, with, as we mentioned already, far fewer range DPS specs towards the top than we have seen, than we are used to see in raid encounters. This has been a very melee DPS favored raid tier. So at the very least, finally, Balanced Druids give a reason as to why they are so popular by following up with their performance. Now, of course, when you look at the raid as a whole, especially once you have completed the raid, once you have cleared the raid, you have hindsight 2020. You start talking and saying things like, well, the only things that matter are the damage profiles for the bosses that are important, for the bosses that are difficult. Basically things like Sylvanas, Kel'Thuzad, Fate Scribe and Painsmith. Those are the more important ones, right? Nobody cares if you do top damage on the 9, on the Eye of the Jailer, and on Ner'zhul. The more important one being, of course, Sylvanas, and we do have quite a few of those popular specs that don't show doing too well in the overall meters, actually doing well on Sylvanas, like Balanced Druid. Before this week, they weren't that high in performance overall, but they have always been very, very good. One of the best specs for Sylvanas. The amount of AoE you can do and you can help with as a Balanced Druid with the chains in phase 1, for example, is very, very good. The fact that you are Ventir and you can have very strong single target burst for the Sylvanas burn phases in phase 2. Balanced Druid was very well suited for that type of damage profile. Marksmanship is another one of the specs that isn't doing too well in the overall meters, but is doing pretty well on Sylvanas herself. But she is more of a unique fight because she is so long and she has so many different situations, which is going to reward various different types of damage profiles. The other bosses are going to follow a much more strict pattern, like Kel'Thuzad. Okay, that is AoE. So on Kel'Thuzad, you will see Elemental Shaman, Affliction Warlock, Windwalker Monk doing top damage because they have top AoE. Fate Scribe can also be similar because of the amount of damage you can do on the adds. It's not as representative compared to KT because on Fate Scribe the adds need to be sniped a little bit more quickly, so there is less room for multiple specs to do top damage. Usually it's just going to be the specs that can pull out their AoE faster and quicker to kill them, essentially. Basically who can pad the best on Fate Scribe, which is also why the AoE of slower specs like Affliction Warlock is not really doing as well as they were doing on Kel'Thuzad, for example. Now, for a second, to look at something towards the future. The, I guess, close future of 9.1.5 giving you multiple avenues to play your Covenants. I am sure there are plenty of raiders who wished they could easily swap between one Covenant or the other depending on the boss fight, but they just can't, of course, because it's very tedious to reroll a Covenant and it's certainly not very fast. But in 9.1.5 it will become a reality. I wish that by the time this change goes live, we are going to be able to have more variety in the Covenant options, particularly when it comes to raid encounters, of course. The situation when it comes to the melee DPS is still good, actually. You know, when you look at this as the top raid Covenants of the specs for melee, it is okay. I would call this satisfying, a satisfying spread of Covenants, wouldn't you? Some of the popular specs are going to be ventier, like Assassination and like Subtlety, and then you have Arms and Havoc keeping up the representation for Night Fae. You have Unholy DK and Windwalker keeping up the Necrolord representation. Yeah, Kyrian is the one left a little bit more out, especially because the specs playing Kyrian are Ret and Survival, which are not particularly popular. So maybe there's going to be some hope for some Kyrian rerolls in 9.1.5. The real issue, to be fair, is with the range DPS. Yeah, so the range DPS have a problem, and that's called Night Fae. There are way too many Night Fae specs being played. Shadow Priest is okay-ish popular, playing Necrolord, which is cool. You have Balanced Druid, of course, and Frost Mage, which luckily play something different and make up for a lot of the popularity of range DPS specs. And then you have the lone Arcane Mage playing Kyrian, but then all of the rest of the range DPS specs, Affliction, BM, Demonology, Destruction, Elemental, and Fire Mage are all Night Fae, so I wish for 9.1.5 to shake things up a bit, especially when it comes to the range DPS. Now, in closing, we're gonna close the video with a thought that popped into my mind when it comes to the raid tiers and the way specs are going to progress through the tier, because Shadowlands is quite a bit different than the latter part of BFA. Looking into a tier months ahead, months after it has been released, now it is much more strict and less prone to changes and surprises. The reason for this is because we lost the vast majority of our borrowed powers. If you remember, things like Eternal Palace started giving you essences, and then later on things like Nyalotha gave you corruptions, which meant that deeper down the tier, specs were unlocking higher and higher ranks of their essences. For example, they could start rolling good and properly nice benthic pieces of gear with their sockets, increasing their damage. In Nyalotha, of course, you had better and better, as well as passively increasing more and more corruption that you could take on yourself, which meant more and more damage, and eventually certain specs were going to hit certain thresholds, certain breakpoints, which made them go crazy. Whereas in Shadowlands, we haven't really gotten this. In Shadowlands, we have gotten Castelnatria, and you basically had no meaningful borrowed powers that made you much stronger over time, and now not really. After the first few weeks where you could get your gems, your shards of domination, and get them to max rank, that was kind of it. You could craft your legendary with its full power since the second week of the tier. You could get all of your shards pretty early. Even if you were unlucky, you would have gotten them a few weeks in, and that's it. After that, it's just item level. So basically, what this means is the only surprises that are going to happen over time is if certain specs are going to change drastically given their item level, but not really anything else. No other borrowed power is going to change drastically the way certain specs are going to perform. For that, you would have to wait for Blizzard, for balance tuning, for, you know, some type of fixes, hot fixes and changes. Otherwise, this is what most likely you're going to get for the rest of the tier. Now, with this disclaimer, I guess, being done, we can stop for the day. I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you have enjoyed the content and want to support the channel, you can leave a like to the video, subscribe to the channel, comment, send me a signed letter of congratulations, give me your thoughts about the state of your relationship if you want some advice, and whatever else you might need. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, well, today is Friday, and Friday I'm going to eat fish.